Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, Libya is going to dominate the news again this week, surely, and we have some fresh perspectives on the crisis. Mark Malloch-Brown, a former Labour Foreign Affairs Minister in the Lords, served at the United Nations and the World Bank, and his new book, part autobiography, part polemic, looks at why global institutions have so little grip at times like these. And then we're going to hear from the historian, David Gilmour, about the country whose dreadful colonial record made Libya miserable long before Gaddafi. And that's Italy, subject of his fine new history. Italy makes us think of Berlusconi, who, along with Gaddafi, raises in turn the question of shame, or perhaps I should say shamelessness, in public life. And Helena Kennedy, barrister and Labour peer, is here to suggest that we need more shame and finger-pointing. First, though, to the author of Libya's Green Book, sponsor of worldwide terror, sartorial buffoon, and, not for the first time, focus of world attention. Daniel Kawczynski, the Conservative MP, has written a biography he called simply Seeking Gaddafi. I think he meant it only in a spirit of intellectual curiosity at the time, rather than as an agent of the International Criminal Court, Daniel. But let's start, as it were, at the beginning of the story and remind ourselves that Libya has had a dreadful history as a country long before Gaddafi. It was sort of spatchcocked together and went through, I hadn't quite understood the sort of genocidal nature, really, of Italy's colonial rule over Libya before the Second World War.
Yes, the Mussolini's control grip over Libya before the Second World War and during it was absolutely brutal, and some estimates put the numbers of killed in Libya was at least somewhere in the region of between 20 and 30% of the population. Mussolini was determined to hold on to that country no matter what, and there was brutal oppression. And in fact, recently, of course, Signor Berlusconi signed a deal with Gaddafi in terms of compensating Libya for all the crimes that took place in Libya during those times.
And then it was essentially a battlefield during the Second World War. There was a long haggle afterwards. We get King Idris, and the only election the Libyans have ever had, 1952, 1953, something like that?
Yes.
And Gaddafi's coup. And in the book you point out that Gaddafi really modelled himself almost entirely on Nasser at the time. We discussed Egypt on this programme before.
Yes, I mean, we mustn't forget also, one of the most poignant things that I've ever done as a Member of Parliament was walking through the British War Cemetery in Tripoli, and row after row after row of immaculately kept graves. One notices just how young these soldiers were when they died in 1943, liberating Tripoli. Quite extraordinary, some of the British sacrifices that took place during the Second World War. So we should also mention that. But certainly, yes, Colonel Gaddafi, in this first year of power, he met with Nasser. Nasser was still alive then. And he looked up to him. He wanted to emulate Nasser. He wanted to be the sort of Nasser of the Arab world. He wanted to lead the Arab world.
He even wanted the two countries to fuse for a while, didn't he? He wanted Libya to become part of Egypt.
Well, he tried a marriage of convenience with all sorts of countries. There was a union with Morocco at one stage. There was a union with Tunisia. There was a union even with Syria. He tried to create a pan-Arab state. Ultimately, his ultimate goal was a pan-Arab state with him at the helm. When that failed to materialize, because each people's country he tried to merge with refused any association.
Thanks
but no thanks. He then turned his attention to Africa, of course, and describing himself as King of Kings, he wanted to be the de facto ruler of Africa with Libya at the helm.
And we tend to see him these days as a sort of darkly comic buffoon figure with his great epaulets and his strange uniforms and his camels and his tents and all the rest of it. But actually, as you recount in this book, for decades, he supported almost any vicious terrorist group around in the world that was going, and caused an immense amount of pain and suffering around the world.
Huge. When he was born in 1943, of course, war was raging around him. British forces were fighting the Italians and Germans. But from that very early period, he got it into his mind that the West was evil, the West was imperialist, the West was out to dominate the world, to control the Arab world. And he became fixated with the West. And his mechanism by which he would confront the West, he knew he couldn't take on the West in terms of military presence and armies. The way he was going to do it is through funding terrorist organizations, guerrilla operations, to try to nibble away and undermine the whole of the sort of democratic West.
And just to take a local example, had his arms shipments to the IRA made it through in total, there would have been absolute mayhem in Ireland, wouldn't there?
Well, absolutely, and of course, this is one of the outstanding things that I know that the previous Labour government and my own government have been working on with Gaddafi, is to try to get compensation for the victims of the IRA. It is absolutely appalling, the amount of support that he gave and shipments, and it's just thanks. I mean,
rocket launchers and missiles and all sorts of stuff that was, most of which was stopped actually before it got to Ireland.
Semtex, it was all there, and he saw the IRA as a very effective tool to use to undermine the United Kingdom.
There's so much we could talk about, but just two other things I want to raise before we bring everybody in. We should not forget the war with Chad, which was one of the most brutal and underreported and under-remembered wars in Africa.
Well, it was over. Again, this shows Gaddafi's sort of ludicrousy. It was over a tiny barren strip, the Azuz strip, on the border with Libya and Chad, a meaningless sort of parcel of land, and he spent literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in pursuing this war, flying tanks from Tripoli into the desert, and it was only actually Chad was helped by her former colonial power, France. France intervened, and of course he lost the war, but it was a huge loss of life. I mean, the sort of numbers that were killed on both sides just over that one war is incredible. I'd just like to say that also we're talking about the devastating situation in Libya now and all the deaths, and we're all deeply shocked by it. But this has been happening in Libya for many, many years, for decades.
So there is an element of huge world hypocrisy. Everyone's throwing up their hands now saying, this man must go because he is killing his own people. Well, he's been killing his own people for 40 years without anybody, doing much about it.
Absolutely, and it's only thanks to this pan-Arab uprising that the whole of the world's media is now focused on the Arab world, that the spotlight has been shone on Gaddafi. But my book actually chronicles the extraordinary brutality, repression and killing that has taken place in Libya over decades. This is a butcher. He makes Ceausescu look positively, sanguine.
Ceausescu, who he much admired, not surprisingly. Just before we open it up, one other point. Does Libya exist? By which I mean, the liberated areas around Cyrenaica. In many respects, people there feel as if they live in a different country anyway. And there's a possibility, I suppose, of Libya breaking up.
There is always that risk, but I think that they are two very different. It's a very big country, first of all, and they are two very different type of regions, Cyrenaica to Tripolitania. But I very much hope that they will stick together. I think there's a tremendous sense amongst people I've spoken to that they want the country to stay together and work together to build a new democracy in a free Libya.
Mark Malloch Brown, you've been watching this in all sorts of different roles. What do you think of?
Well, the stories are legion, but they all go back to the fact that a slightly buffoon-like figure who nevertheless is ruthless and violent in his internal oppression and equipped with a huge checkbook from his oil revenue can cause vast, unaccountable consequences way beyond his own borders. And I saw this both at the UN, where we constantly, I mean, Kofi Annan, as Secretary General, went off to look for him once to try and get him to kind of pull back on Chad. Only time I ever lost as Secretary General. Anxiously in New York, we couldn't find him until he finally showed up at a tent in the desert. But I think, fast forwarding to the Labour government years where I saw a bit of this, obviously, Gaddafi had been brought back into the community of nations by a Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, desperate to play himself back into Middle East politics after Iraq. This gets inherited by Gordon Brown, who finds when he's organising the G20 that Gaddafi is now chairman of the African Union and the man he must invite to the G20 summit to represent Africa in London. So I'm sent off to the African Union with an instruction to find an alternative representative, because whatever happens, don't come back telling me, says the Prime Minister, telling me that man is going to pitch his expletive-deleted tent in Hyde Park.
And the camels. Well, of course, we joke about it, but he pitched his tent and camels in the middle of Paris and many other places on the way around.
I'm here, of course, because I want to talk about ethics, and by God does this issue bring up the whole question of ethics in the international domain, because hypocrisy is the word to use here, because we've always known what Gaddafi stood for and the way that he behaved towards his people, the human rights abuses that any of us involved in the human rights world knew what he was up to. And yet this business of bringing him in from the cold was celebrated as some great achievement, when in fact we know that it was about oil. It was about some of the ugliest kind of dealing. And let us remember the jobs that came out of that, the number of people who ended up immediately going into BP and got the rewards that came from doing the deal with Gaddafi. So there's a real issue.
MI6 officers leaving MI6 in Libya and going to work for BP.
Members of senior Labour persons. And I understand that Mr Blair has, in the last 7 months, had a whole series of meetings with Gaddafi. And that wasn't mostly. And that's not about the yearning for democracy of people. I suspect it's about business. And I think that doing business with somebody who has the history of this man, and let's remember, until very recently, this was the man who was behind, it said, the killing in Lockerbie of many, many people, many deaths, and yet nothing happens in his in Libya without him knowing about it. That he had his hand on all of that, and yet we embraced him to get oil.
Well, there are stories that the people responsible for the Lockerbie bombings are still with him in the barracks at the moment. David Gilmour.
Yes, I think we all hope that the Libyans themselves will get rid of Gaddafi. But if they don't, if he does fight back, we have to be very careful about the sort of intervention that's going to happen. We must hope it will be done by the Arab League. And be very careful that it's not led by the West, especially Britain and America. I don't think that we realise how unpopular we are still on the Arab Street, not just as a result of the invasion of Iraq, but also of Blair's failure to criticise the invasion of Lebanon, for example.
Daniel Kawczynski, the point that this has been a sort of an embarrassing stain on British diplomacy. Would you go along with that? I mean, I remember Malcolm Rifkin saying that he thought it was the worst example of organised diplomatic hypocrisy in modern British history, or something like that.
I participated in a debate, the Doha debates in Qatar, where we debated in front of a totally Arab audience whether or not it was right to release Mr al-Megrahi, for example. Yes. And we won that overwhelmingly. And
so you saying it wasn't right to win it, to release him?
Yes. It says this House,
to be clear,
to be clear, this House deplores the release of Mr al-Megrahi. And what was very interesting is that a lot of the young Arabs listening to that program said to me, on the one hand, you're telling us that you are pursuing anti-terrorism agenda around the world, but on the other hand, you're releasing a convicted bomber of the worst terrorist atrocity on your soil since the Second World War. So that's sending out very mixed messages. And I think that we have bent over backwards to accommodate Colonel Gaddafi and yet got very little in return apart from these oil contracts. I mean, don't forget, the other thing that my book mentions is PC Yvonne Fletcher. Killing of a British police officer.
In St James's Square, yes.
In St James's Square. We still don't have her killer. And I hope one of the things resulting from this collapse of the Gaddafi regime is that finally we will start to see the Metropolitan Police will be allowed back into Libya to try to find the killer of our serving police officers.
The story we were told was that there were weapons of mass destruction, that he was on a course to creating weapons of mass destruction, and we still haven't heard whether that was ever true.
No, indeed. Well, let's move on to another part of this story, in a sense, which is that we see on our television screens and read in our newspapers the international community, the Security Council, all these people in suits raising their hands solemnly to get resolutions passed about Colonel Gaddafi, and we all wonder, how much does it really mean? How much does it count? In the unfinished global revolution, Mark Malloch Brown, you have you're quite scathing about aspects of world governance, and you've seen it from the inside. World Bank, United Nations. You've spent your career, a lot of your career, doing this kind of stuff. Where do you? I mean, I suppose where do you start in all of this? Do we start from a post-war settlement in terms of international institutions, a post-1945 one, which simply doesn't work anymore?
Well, obviously, if you've been in the business I'm in, you're still an optimist.
Yes.
What you've got to retain is the ability to say, look, this isn't working, how can we improve it? So I come at it from that perspective. But, in 1945, something extraordinary was done because an American leadership recognized that the consequence of the Second World War was that the world's problems were going to be dropped into its lap. And it still had a lot of domestic things to do. And so, Roosevelt and then Truman saw the United Nations, above all else, as burden sharing the problems of global security and global development. It was a very pragmatic construct. And I hope that emerging powers like China and India, who are now having a portion of the world's problem dropped onto their laps, are going to recognise that coming back to multilateral arrangements is in their interests as much as anybody else's, and that they will, in a sense, be the leaders of the renewal of these institutions. Because, in recent years, countries such as Britain and France have become rather lonely champions of the UN, while emerging powers have said we don't have enough stake in it. They sort of look to other arrangements. The US has been a terrible sort of, if you like, a la carte user of it. When it wants to, it does. When it doesn't, it doesn't. And the whole system has sort of sagged a bit, got demoralised, underinvested in, etc.
And yet you say you're an optimist, but you also say in this book that there is a kind of quiet, creeping revolution going on in international governance or international politics, whatever we call it.
Yes, because problems have gone global. We saw it with the financial crisis when even America couldn't fix the banks. It needed to appeal to other countries to come together as the G20.
Where do we look for the reform movements, as it were?
Well, I think we look for them around different issues. Extraordinary coalitions of individual countries who are leaders on some particular issue, landmines or climate change, combine with foundations, not-for-profit organisations, philanthropists, and, strikingly, businesses to try and fix problems. And I, in the book, give lots of examples of this. The coalition that broke the dramatic increase in the rate of HIV/AIDS infections around the world, which was, a disparate bunch.
Is it a bit like what happens inside countries, is that you need the state and you need private life and all of that, but between the two, for a civilised society, you need civil institutions. And in a sense, you're saying what we're seeing is the growth of, as it were, civil institutions at a world level.
Yeah, I think at the moment the state is a kind of passive, reactive follower, if the analogy is that it's the United Nations, and that indeed those civil society institutions are very much the leaders. The balance of power is different at the global level to the national. And what I hope is that the United Nations and other bits of the system will kind of respond to the challenge and opportunity and raise their game in response to what civil society is doing.
Could I ask a pessimist's question in all of this, which seems to be part of the problem, is that almost nobody feels any sense of ownership or connection with international bodies or international leaders, because inevitably they're going to be people from another part of the world for most people, and so on. And politics has always been rooted in some sort of democratic connection between the ruled and the rulers, which cannot happen on an international level. And I see no way round this. I see no mechanism by which we can feel more connected to international institutions?
Well, I think 3 points. I mean, one, they're always going to remain institutions which are kind of represented by stakeholders, states primarily, but businesses, NGOs, others as well. We're not going to move to a kind of global, directly elected parliament of any kind. So I actually, in my vision of these things, a strong national state looking after its people's interests is the absolutely critical connection and is not replaced by this. It's just that
so we shouldn't expect ever a popular United Nations.
Well, no, I think, it'll be
Council.
It'll be popular by secondary effect because a British politician will be able to come home and say, I fixed that climate change or employment problem which is affecting British voters. But just 2 quick points on it as well. I mean, I think it is additionally fair to say that in someone like Kofi Annan, who I worked for, a Ghanaian, nevertheless a global figure with a sort of real beginnings of a kind of international political celebrity to him, which is, I think, one reason certain politicians around the world wanted to take him down a notch. And finally, of course, the book itself is an attempt to kind of open up some of this, to kind of take the little black box of globalization and say, look, nothing affects all our lives more. Here's a kind of somebody who's in the front row, had a bit of a seat at some of these key events. This is my effort to kind of make it more personal for everybody.
Helena Kennedy.
I enjoyed your book greatly, Mark, and you had an amazing career. And I have heard you described as the most charming man in the international stage, and the book told me why that was. But I did laugh the other day when I heard that they were voting for Gaddafi to be brought before courts for crimes against humanity. And I thought, yeah, but what about the fact that the United States that's calling for this hasn't signed up to the International Criminal Court? And I'm like you, an optimist, and I do believe that you need to have global institutions. But I think that in many ways we have to embrace the bigger challenges, which is it is almost impossible to get people to agree around the kind of institutions and how you can make them really work. I think that we're really talking about here. We still have to grapple with the fact that we're talking about globalisation being about globalised money. It's about capitalism and about the problems about restraining that, because that's what makes the problems of poverty. That's what makes the problems about not getting to grips with the environmental issues. All those things, because in the end, making money corrupts the efforts to improve things. And so I think it's harder than we'll ever know unless we get to grips with that central question.
I suspect, Daniel Kawczynski, you might disagree with that a little bit.
I'm surprising myself how much I'm agreeing with, actually, with Baroness Kennedy from the Labour Party. But I think that with regards to the United Nations, obviously there is a lot of hypocrisy that goes on. I mean, China, obviously, is a very important power in the UN on the Security Council, and yet has appalling human rights abuses as well.
And yet voted against Gaddafi, I noticed, at the Security Council. It's quite interesting.
Yes, interesting that they did that. But I think that if the UN is going to have real credibility moving forward for the next generation, then something has to be done about the paradox that some of the most powerful countries in the United Nations actually have quite poor human rights backgrounds themselves, such as Russia and China.
David Gilmour.
I understand absolutely the need for stronger global institutions to tackle problems of poverty and the environment, but you also say we should have they should have rules in place that allow for peaceful adjustments between states. But how could that happen if the United Nations can't do it? I mean, all the rules in the world say that Israel should not be building settlements on Arab land in the West Bank. But if the United Nations can't stop that, what mechanism could?
Well, I think, David, I mean, that's the nub of it, and you've all, in a sense, touched on it from different points, which is, at the moment, it has a very weak and selective authority when states in the Security Council choose to empower it, and there's a dramatic inconsistency. I mean, a Chinese participant today would make the very point you've just made in response to Daniel. You say, sure, we may have internal problems, but what about US double standards in the Middle East? And the fact is we've got to build a culture of respect for common, supported rules of international behaviour. So, the International Criminal Court, America isn't yet a signatory. I have no doubt that privately Obama would want to be a signatory. Sure. The fact that they have now used it this weekend as a sanction against Libya is, to me, an important incremental step forward.
Absolutely. Right. I was interested.
Well, of course, international means based on nations, and we've discussed already Italy's role in Libyan history and the possibility that Libya might one day break up. David Gilmour, in your book, The Pursuit of Italy, there is a huge sort of question mark hanging over the whole notion of Italy as a unified nation. It was late into the game, late into the colonial game as a result of that. You quote several times the great phrase about it being a sin against history and geography, I think, the notion of a united Italy. How much do you think Italy's geography has affected its political story?
Oh, I think geography has prevented Italy from ever acquiring that sense of national identity that could have led to a successful state. I mean, it's the most easily invaded country in the world, right? The sea from all sides. Every army from Hannibal's to Napoleon's has come over the Alps, and it's therefore become a country of settlers and invaders. I mean, in the 9th century in England, the Anglo-Saxons united to form a nation against the Danish threat. In the 9th century in Italy, you had the Arabs in Sicily, you had the Byzantines in Apulia, you had Franks, Lombards, Goths, Romans elsewhere. Then you had the Normans coming to the south, and you had the Albanians emigrating. And you couldn't form a sense of national identity out of that.
So without the extraordinary story of this kind of fanatically militaristic and aggressive little city, Rome, right at the beginning, pushing outwards, then it's, as it were, always invited people in.
Yes, in a way, Italy either has to be an empire or it's more or less a colony.
You take the story all the way through, starting right at the beginning, and we can't tell the whole story, obviously. But there is that extraordinary moment in the 19th century when you get all these wonderful red-shirted Garibaldi supporters and great idealistic statesmen. And it does seem for a while as if Italy is going to become, a great liberal country along the 19th century model.
Yes, I think actually the national movement in Italy was very small. It was overwhelmingly northern and middle class. Very few people in the country, very few people in the south wanted it at all. And in fact, without the support of France, the French army in 1859 and the Prussian army in 1866, I don't think Italy would have been united, certainly not by themselves at that time. I mean, in the crucial year of 1859 for the north, just 20,000 Italians volunteered to fight for the cause, out of a population of 25 million.
I didn't know yet. And you also refer to the wonderful myth, you think it's a myth, that Verdi was so popular because when you stood up and you shouted Verdi, it meant, come on, Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy.
Yes, I think the evidence for that is 3 months at La Scala in 1959, but it's become part of the Italian 1859. Yeah. The Italian opera houses up and down the country were all shouting out "Viva Verdi!"
And many of the things that people love about Italy to this day, which, for instance, the variety and richness of the architecture and the cuisine, and the number of different dialects and languages around Italy, all, again, point to the notion that this is a very strange unitary state.
It is. It's a country of terrific diversity. And Italians still think of themselves as Tuscans or Venetians. And even Tuscans prefer to think of themselves as Pisans or Livornese or Florentines. It is a very local country, and the dialects are extraordinary. You see, when Italy was united, it is estimated that only 2.5% of Italians spoke what we now know as Italian. Everybody else spoke dialects, which you couldn't understand in the other regions.
So the very notion of Italian is new as well.
Yes, and the way that the early governments tried to make Italy was to try to make Italians, was to try to make Italy a great power, make them all fight wars, and this was just ended up with fascism and the humiliation of the Second World War. And now Italy is a completely denationalised state.
Does that explain Berlusconi? Is that how they end up with someone like Silvio Berlusconi at the helm?
Well, Berlusconi an Italian phenomenon, but he's not typical of Italian politics. I mean, for a start, he's won 3 thumping electoral victories that nobody else has done. I think Berlusconi has other advantages. Firstly, that the right has a natural majority in Italy. It's about 55 to 45. And then... and
he's the first person who's managed to unite the different groups on the right together under one banner.
Yes. Well, also, he has control of almost the entire television, which is the only media that counts in Italian elections.
Yes. Do you think that Italy will stay together?
I think it can only survive if it becomes a truly federal state, which is what it should have been all along, in which the individual regions allowed to spend their revenues on their own projects. I mean, in a properly united country, like say England, the richer regions take it for granted that they will subsidise the poorer ones. But in a country in Italy, the North does not feel it should be producing so much of its revenue to support what's going on in Sicily and Calabria, especially as they know quite a lot of that money is going into the mafia.
There's a huge amount of immigration and a huge amount of mafia and very little industry and massive quantities of EU dosh going down to keep the thing going in the south.
Yes.
And a highly productive, tax-paying, vigorous north.
Exactly, yes. I mean, the north are losing about...
And Rome stuck in the middle.
Rome disliked by both sides.
Yes. What are the rest of it? You're an Italiophile.
Yes, I love
Baroness
Italy.
Kennedy.
Yes, but I mean, the thing about it is that perhaps some nations have some strengths and not others. And nation building and perhaps the creation of institutions is not where Italy's strengths lie. It's in art, it's in its painting, it's in all its creative stuff. But that business of institutions, which of course Mark has been talking about at the world level, isn't that the problem in Italy? That it's never really got its institutions up and running in a really strong way. If you want to bring people together under nations, then you need to have good legal systems. You need to have your political system working well. And it didn't ever create institutions that had that capacity. And that's been one of the problems, isn't it?
Yes. Well, at the time of unification, Piedmont imposed, not only conquered the rest of the country, it also imposed its own laws on the rest of the country and its institutions and its monarch. And this was not accepted well by the rest of the country, especially not in the south.
You see, the other thing is that globalisation creates for people this sense of wanting to retreat into smaller groupings and communities and so on. The fear of the big makes people... That's why we've seen the rise of this identity around smaller...
Well, David's very eloquent on the importance of the commune and commune life and everything being local.
That is the centre of Italian life, the loyalty to the local commune.
It does make me think that if Italy is now constitutional rubble, as it were, then it was ever thus. It's always been the most beautiful, alluring, gorgeous rubble in the world, and people have always come there for that to enjoy it.
I thought there was a wonderful fact which goes to this, which was that shortly after reunification of Italy, there were more soldiers trying to hold the country together than the British had across their whole empire. And that says everything, because, I think today, whether it is Iraq, Afghanistan or Gaddafi and Libya, we've forgotten the most simple lesson of political rule, which is don't go against the grain, secure the consent of people. And if you're trying to construct a country that people don't want to live in, you're not going to get that consent, and that's when you have to shove in hundreds of thousands of troops. There's no substitute for people accepting the political entity of which they are part.
Daniel.
I think it's interesting that Signor Berlusconi, we've been talking about him, is actually the closest to Gaddafi of all the European leaders, and I think has met Gaddafi on 17 occasions over the last 2 years. And no matter how much we criticise no matter how much I like to criticise Mr. Brown and Mr. Blair, I think they've shown slightly more caution towards Gaddafi compared to somebody like Mr. Berlusconi, who has blatantly, in the pursuit of Italian business interests and oil contracts, curried favour with this man.
Well, you bring us perfectly to our final guest today, Helena Kennedy, who is going to be giving a lecture called Ethics in a Changing World. And it could be said that Berlusconi is the prime Western example of cheerful shamelessness about everything from money to sex and politics in between. Helena, I suppose the first question, however, is whether anything has really changed when it comes to public ethics. You look back and you can... The biggest change is perhaps merely that we know more about how people in positions of power and authority behave, rather than that they behave any differently or worse.
I think you're right. I mean, a lot of it's to do with transparency, that we and the whole business of communication means that we actually do know much more. I'm not looking back to a golden age. I think we're all ethically compromised, and I wouldn't suggest for a minute that I have any less human frailty than anybody else. But all I would say is that I started thinking about this issue of ethics, and it's come around this table today. I mean, first of all, in our responsibility to the rest of the world, and when you look at the way in which the rich world lives and the poor world is so often abandoned. But I really wanted to bring it even closer to home, which is that I think that I started thinking about this particular issue around the business of expenses and the scandal around MPs and House of Lords abuses of the system, and about a sense that people seem to have, which was, well, I wasn't breaking the law, so that made it all right. So there wasn't something sort of just below the legal standard, which was about behaving decently. And what is it that makes people ethical, and what are the constraints that operate? And I think that one of the things, of course, and you started off this programme today talking about shame, I think that it's been interesting that people haven't felt very ashamed of some of the things that have gone on, and actually will still brazen it out. And we had it not just over MPs' expenses and the business of Lord's claims, but the dodgy dossier. There was no sort of humbling or embarrassment over having created a false premise for going to war. The banking thing, there's still business of claiming huge bonuses. No shaming, despite the scandalous stuff.
Can I ask? We were talking just a moment ago about the importance of the commune and the town and the society. Is it that so many people don't really live in a society or a group of people in front of whom they would feel ashamed?
That's one of the things that I've looked at, which is that I think that because people have lost their sense of community, those whom they would feel embarrassed in front of. I mean, we're probably constrained, because certainly I am, that my Catholic family in Glasgow would be horrified if they thought that I was on the fiddle. And in the same way, I belong to another community, which is the legal community, the bar that I belong to. And again, I would be ashamed if people felt that I somehow did inappropriate things as a professional.
It's that cold look across the table, that across the breakfast table or the dinner table, that matters so much. But
I don't think that there's very much of that. I think there's a sense in which we're not supposed to be judgmental. But I really, at the heart of this, I don't want to just deal with the sort of psychology of that. I want to deal with the fact that I think that I want to talk about the public, the common good. And I think that one of the things that's happening in our society is that because we are sort of bringing the values of the business world, where profit is the important thing, how much money you earn is so important, all those things that are valued there, by introducing them into, for example, public service, denigrating public service, and by people feeling, well, the only thing that matters is how much you're paid, for example, or that you reach your targets, that somehow you start degrading the good stuff in our society.
So what is the way back?
Well, I think that, you see, I of course, I'm very anxious about the privatisation of public services, because I think that what you do is you end up making the value is about money, and I do think that by doing so we are actually interfering with some of the best stuff that happens in our society. It's about valuing the things that everything has a price, but nothing has. We don't value the stuff that are really important.
Daniel Kawczynski.
Well, I was very interested in what Baroness Kennedy was saying about politicians and how they stand up to people around them in terms of being accountable. I think it's this expenses scandal has been. I'm glad we're over the worst of it now, but I had a public meeting in my own constituency immediately afterwards. I mean, I think the 300 people turned up, and there was such an palpable anger. Luckily, my expenses were in the clear, but people were very angry generally because they felt very betrayed. And I think that you've got to make politicians very cognizant of being accountable to the people they represent. I mean, I ignored advice from the Fees Office. The Fees Office were churning out all sorts of advice.
That is the thing. It was a little club who said, it's fine. You do this, everyone does it. And it takes quite a lot to stand up and say, well, actually, no thanks, I don't think that does look good.
Well, I did, and I won't go into all the details, but I certainly said to the Fees Office, under no circumstances am I following this advice. But why did I do that? Because at the end of the day, I thought to myself, how would my constituents think about me behaving in this way?
You thought about the local newspaper, really, or something like that. What would it look like?
What would it look like? You know, local Tory MP does X, Y, and Z. But and the thing is, you've got to go back to your people and you meet them. If you live in the community, you've got to look in their faces. And I think if you abuse their trust, you can no longer stand for election.
I mean, my point really is, in a global world, unfortunately, Glasgow or the local constituency becomes a long way away, and we're creating these global financial elites and allowing them to reward themselves in a way completely detached from, if you like, the value they contribute.
And they can go around and only meet and live alongside each other. That's the other thing.
And
it's a real danger.
In the countries in which they're...
But Helena, how can you inculcate this sense of shame? I imagine you can do it as a child and bring religion into it, but otherwise isn't it just exposing them in the media? And aren't we therefore slightly playing the tabloids game?
Well, I mean, I don't think this has to be about religion. I think it's about a sense of what is right and decent, and I think we've stopped talking about our responsibility to each other, because at the end, a large part of it is about that. The things that people that we don't like are things where we feel it's not... There's a sort of looking after number one and not thinking about the collective good. And I think we have to have a better conversation about what the common good is.
Well, our better conversation must now come to an end because we've run out of time. But thank you very much to all my guests today. Helena Kennedy will be giving her last lecture as president of the School of Oriental and African Studies, called Ethics in a Changing World, on Thursday. Daniel Kawczynski's book, Seeking Gaddafi, was published last year. Malloch Brown's The Unfinished Global Revolution and David Gilmour's The Pursuit of Italy are out in all good bookshops this week. Next week, environmental disasters with the Australian conservationists Tim Flannery and Peter Harris and Richard Susskind on justice and the law. But for now, thank you and goodbye. The sort of genocidal nature, really, of Italy's colonial rule over Libya before the Second World War.
Yes, the Mussolini's control grip over Libya before the Second World War and during it was absolutely brutal, and some estimates put the numbers of killed in Libya, it was at least somewhere in the region of between 20 and 30% of the population. Mussolini was determined to hold on to that country no matter what, and there was brutal oppression. And in fact, recently, of course, Signor Berlusconi signed a deal with Gaddafi in terms of compensating Libya for all the crimes that took place in Libya during those...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, Libya is going to dominate the news again this week, surely, and we have some fresh perspectives on the crisis. Malloch Brown, a former Labour Foreign Affairs Minister in the Lords, served at the United Nations and the World Bank, and his new book, part autobiography, part polemic, looks at why global institutions have so little grip at times like these. And then we're going to hear from the historian, David Gilmour, about the country whose dreadful colonial record made Libya miserable long before Gaddafi. That's Italy, subject of his fine new history. Italy makes us think of Berlusconi, who, along with Gaddafi, raises in turn the question of shame, or perhaps I should say...
liberating Tripoli. Quite extraordinary, some of the British sacrifices that took place during the Second World War, so we should also mention that. But certainly, yes, Colonel Gaddafi, in this first year of power, he met with Nasser. Nasser was still alive then. and he looked up to him. He wanted to emulate Nasser. He wanted to be the sort of Nasser of the Arab world. He wanted to lead the Arab world.
He even wanted the two countries to fuse for a while, didn't he? He wanted Libya to become part of Egypt.
Well, he tried a marriage of convenience with all sorts of countries. There was a union with Morocco at one stage. There was a union with Tunisia. There was a union even with Syria. He tried to create a pan-Arab state. Ultimately, I think his ultimate goal.
Shamelessness in public life. And Helena Kennedy, barrister and Labour peer, is here to suggest that we need more shame and finger-pointing. First, though, to the author of Libya's Green Book, sponsor of worldwide terror, sartorial buffoon, and, not for the first time, focus of world attention. Daniel Kawczynski, the Conservative MP, has written a biography he called simply Seeking Gaddafi. I think he meant it only in a spirit of intellectual curiosity at the time, rather than as an agent of the International Criminal Court, Daniel. But let's start, as it were, at the beginning of the story and remind ourselves that Libya has had a dreadful history as a country long before Gaddafi. It was sort of spatchcocked together and went through, I hadn't quite understood
during those times.
And then it was essentially a battlefield during the Second World War. There was a long haggle afterwards. We get King Idris, and the only election the Libyans have ever had, 1952, 1953, something like that?
Yes.
And Gaddafi's coup. And in the book you point out that Gaddafi really modelled himself almost entirely on Nasser at the time. We discussed Egypt on this programme before.
Yes, we mustn't forget also, one of the most poignant things that I've ever done as a Member of Parliament was walking through the British War Cemetery in Tripoli, and row after row after row of immaculately kept graves. One notices just how young these soldiers were when they died in 1940.